guys, what's up? Welcome back to my channel and welcome to today's addition to my series Pretty Faces Cold Cases, where we do our makeup together and talk about true crime cases from in the past. You guys know that I am obsessed with true crime. This is what I watch and what I do and what I'm interested in on my own time. I have always been this way. It's just very intriguing to me from a psychological standpoint, especially with serial killers and just unsolved cases in general. And I know a lot of you guys have the exact same interest, so I figured why not just do our makeup together, talk about true crime, and maybe come up with some theories that nobody else has thought of. Today we're going to be going over a true crime case that is over 50 years old at this point. We just hit the 51st anniversary back in July. We're going to be discussing a family of 6 that unfortunately their murder case has yet to be solved. So I hope you guys are excited. Grab your wine, grab your snacks, set me up, girl, maybe clean, while we talk about some true crime. Now, before we get into this true crime case and start with our makeup, I do want to give a special shout out and thank you to my friends over at Sundance Now for sponsoring this video. Thank you guys so much. If you guys haven't heard of Sundance Now, let me tell you a little something, okay? Because I guarantee you, if you're like me and you're interested in true crime and unsolved cases and things like that, you are going to love Sundance Now. Sundance Now is a really cool streaming service that you can access at any time over iPhone, Android, your television, wherever you want to watch it. They offer original and exclusive dramas, thrillers, and true crime series on their streaming app, okay? So I don't know about you, but every time I go on to like Netflix or Hulu, a lot of times I've already seen those thriller movies or seen the true crime documentaries, been there, done that, and I was looking for something new, and Sundance Now really came through with that. They have award-winning movies from every genre that you can imagine, including foreign language and documentaries, but the really cool thing about it is that it's all ad-free, okay? So you don't have to look at ads, kind of like Hulu, and you don't have to stop your true crime investigation while you're watching any series on Sundance Now, which I really appreciated because I get really into it and I hate taking a pause because like I'm trying to get all the clues, you know? Recently on Sundance Now, I have been obsessed with this show called Killing for Love, which is about these 2 young lovebirds, and the woman, her parents actually got killed. Guy is saying that she did it. She's saying that he did it because he was obsessed with her and in love with her, and he was only 18 at the time. They were very young. Well, they tried to like skip off to London. They actually ended up getting caught in London. I won't tell you guys the whole story and spoil it for you, but they ended up getting extradited back here to the United States, and there's so much mystery. It's basically like a whodunit series, okay? They turned on each other ultimately, and she's saying that he did it. He's saying that he did not do it, that she did it, and she's crazy. And like there's a lot of accusations between her and her parents, and you guys, the parents were brutally murdered. So whoever did this really like had no mercy. So if it really was their daughter, oh my god. So that is the one that I'm watching. Again, that's called Killing for Love. And the really cool thing about it is, you guys remember Amanda Knox? You remember her whole situation over there in Italy, and she was stuck over there for years in the Italian prison because they believe that she murdered her roommate. Okay, she actually has a podcast, and she was talking about this series Killing for Love and how some of the information paralleled with her own story. It was absolutely amazing in the most terrible way. Just the process of trying to figure out who's telling the truth is just like really, it's a thriller. You're really trying to piece it all together and put the puzzle pieces together. Meanwhile, they are both still sitting in jail. It really does make you wonder who did it. If you guys are interested in Sundance Now, which I'm telling you guys, I would totally recommend it. If you're anything like me and you love true crime, check out my description box. I will leave some more information down there, and we'll discuss it a little bit more at the end of our true crime investigation. I'm going to be telling you guys the good Hart story. Usually in my previous Pretty Faces Cold Cases series, we have gone to Hong Kong and we have also traveled to London, but today we're actually going to be staying in the United States. Excuse me if I keep looking down throughout this video. It's because my makeup is down here, but also I have so many notes, a lot of different articles and newspapers from back in the day regarding this case that I want to share with you guys because I don't want to miss anything, and there are just so many different factors, so many different details that I want to get right. I worked very hard on this case and trying to get as much information that I can from reliable sources because not everything is true on the internet. So it took me some digging, so I definitely had to like organize all my thoughts. So without further ado, let's get into today's Pretty Faces Cold Cases. So today we are actually going to be traveling to the lovely state of Michigan. Now, if you guys have never been to Michigan, you know, it has beautiful parts, but it also has some like crazy parts, you know, like Detroit. Today's story is actually going to be taking place near Lake Michigan, specifically Blisswood Resort Community, which was actually located a few miles north from Hart, which is why I named this the Hart story. This area was located right near Lake Michigan, which was a prime location for vacationers for the summer. This whole story took place in the summer of 1968, so a while back, like I mentioned. We're going to be talking about a family of 6, and they were actually like an upper middle class family, and they were originally from Lathrop Village. Let's go over the actual members of the family. Now, their names were the Robeson family. The father was Richard Robeson, who was 42 years old. The wife was Shirley Robeson, and she was 40 years old. Richard and Shirley shared 4 children together. Their oldest son was Richard Jr., but he was called Richie, and he was 19 years old. Next, they had their son Gary, who was 17. Their third son Randy, who was 12, and they also had a little girl named Susan, who was 8 years old at this time. So like I said, this family was from Lathrop Village, Michigan, but they had a family cabin near Lake Michigan in the Blisswood Resort Community, which was like this very quaint area. It was kind of secluded. There was like a lot of trees, a lot of lush environment around them, and right behind the house was Lake Michigan. So they went there to go swimming, fishing, hunting, vacationing, you know, and they would stay there for long periods of time, like the whole summer. They would stay there the whole season, right? So in the summer of 1968, the Robeson family took their annual vacation to their family cottage near Lake Michigan as per usual, but only a mere 2 weeks into their vacation, things took a terrible turn and their family vacation house turned into a slaughterhouse. Let's talk about Mr. Robeson, the father, because his role in this entire situation really matters in the investigation. Mr. Robeson was an extremely successful advertising executive and magazine publisher for a magazine called Impresario back in the 60s, right? Now, Mr. Robeson was head honcho, so that meant that he could like vacation anytime he wanted to, and he was constantly leaving the office and going on vacation with his family to Hawaii, different parts of the US, and of course, his seasonal cabin there near Lake Michigan. In his absence, he did have a right-hand man in the office named Mr. Joseph Solero, who would take care of day-to-day office executive decisions and of course keep Mr. Robeson involved anytime he needed to be. But Mr. Robeson always had somebody watching out for the office and day-to-day functions while he was gone. Now, this cottage was actually built just a few years prior, about a decade prior in the 50s, by a man named Chauncey Bliss, who lived in that area all year around. And that man actually built this cottage with his bare hands, and Mr. Robeson bought it from him and actually became really good friends with Mr. Bliss. Now, Mr. Bliss not only built this cottage, but he was also the property caretaker when the families were away. So when you had a vacation home in this area, if Mr. Bliss was the one that built it or owned it at one point, he would also take care of the properties, including Mr. Robeson's cottage, during off season. So we're going to be fast forwarding to basically the last time that the whole family was seen alive, which was June 24th, 1968. And it just so happened that Mr. Robeson went to go visit Mr. Chauncey Bliss, who was, like I said, the caretaker of the cottage during off season. Mr. Robeson had been reported to have gone to visit Mr. Bliss at his home to unfortunately offer his condolences because Mr. Chauncey Bliss's son had recently passed away, and so Mr. Robeson was going over to his house to go pay his respects, and he also apparently left $20 with Mr. Bliss for flowers and, you know, just kind of visit with him and see how he was doing after the passing of his son. So like I said, that was June 24th, 1968. During that visit, Mr. Bliss reported that Mr. Robeson had actually told him that he and his whole family were actually going to be leaving pretty soon to travel to Kentucky because they were interested in purchasing property out there. So he was letting Mr. Bliss know, like, hey, we're going to be here until the end of the week, and then after that, were going to be gone in Kentucky through August, and he was letting Mr. Bliss know so that he could be the caretaker of the cottage while they were away. Now, there was nothing out of the ordinary about this visit. After that conversation was had, Mr. Robeson left Mr. Bliss's house and returned to his cottage with his family. Now, we're going to fast forward almost an entire month, okay? 27 days to be exact. There was a neighbor. Now, keep in mind, like I said, this area was pretty secluded, and what I mean by that is like there was a lot of space between the neighbors over there because, you know, it's a lot of land. It's by the lake, so a lot of times when you have, you know, a lake house, there's quite a bit of space between yourself and the neighbors. It was said that it was over half a mile between the cottage and any neighbors surrounding it, right? And one of the Robison's neighbors that, again, was like over half a mile away was having a bridge party. So she had like a bunch of people over and they were partying and having fun and, you know, just enjoying their summer, enjoying themselves outside near the lake and everything. But they couldn't enjoy themselves that much because there was a terrible stench. Like it stunk so bad and it smelled like rot. So the neighbor actually went to go find the caretaker, Mr. Bliss, to let him know there's a really funky smell. Like I can't have my guests outside. We're trying to enjoy ourselves and we think that there might be like a dead deer. They all assumed that it must have been a dead animal. Didn't want to like go investigate themselves, so they just went ahead and told Mr. Bliss about it. Upon hearing this, Mr. Bliss went ahead and took off in the area that the smell was detected and followed the smell through, you know, the area and actually ended up following it all the way back to the Robison's cottage. Now, like I said, he had already assumed that the Robisons were gone to go to Kentucky to see that property that Mr. Robeson had told him about prior. So he knew that the likelihood of them being there was slim to none. There was no doubt about it. He smelled it. He knew exactly what the neighbors were talking about. And he honestly just thought that it had to have been like a dead deer. There was, you know, there was deer out there and, you know, animals. So he thought that there had to have been like a large animal to give off that type of stench, and that maybe it was like underneath like the porch or like around the cabin, and that he was gonna have to dispose of this dead carcass, right? So he gets closer and closer to this cabin, and as he approaches, he realizes that that stench is just becoming so bad. He looks all around the cabin. He's not seeing any sign of a dead animal anywhere. So he's like walking around the entire property, right, trying to figure out the source of this smell, and he ends up going like on the back side of the cottage, which is like nearest the lake, and he sees something really strange. Mr. Bliss ends up seeing bullet holes in the back window of the cottage leading inward. So Mr. Bliss is looking through the windows and he sees, you guys, a body on the floor of the living room, and he starts freaking out and he recognizes this body to be Mr. Robeson. So he immediately contacts the police and lets them know that there's been a murder in that cottage. Police arrive on the scene and they of course start doing investigation immediately. They enter the cottage, and I'm gonna put up a map of what they saw, okay? So as you can see from this map here, it was reported that there were 5 shots that were fired from the outside of the cottage inward using a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle. Those initial shots appeared to have been what took Mr. Robison's life. Now, if you look at this map, it shows you exactly where the bodies were found inside of this cottage. All the family members were actually in the same area. They were in the living room during the time of this attack. Mr. Robeson was sitting in a chair. Shirley was also in an armchair in the living room as well. Both Richard Jr. and Gary were playing cards at the table. Little Susan was playing on the floor in the living room. So they were all around each other in the same vicinity inside of the cottage. Now, this all had to have happened very quickly. So you have 5 shots entering the cabin from the rear. Then the killer entered the cabin from the back door and began shooting at Shirley, who was the wife, while Randy and little Susan tried to run and take cover. So while this was happening, Richard Jr. and Gary, who were the oldest sons, they tried to make it to a back room of the cottage where they knew a family rifle was kept. And they were trying to get to that gun to defend themselves and their family. But unfortunately, the killer was right on their tails and caught them in the back room and ended up shooting both of them in the head with a .25 caliber handgun. So that means that this killer had 2 guns on him. One .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle that he used from the outside. By the time he got inside, he switched switched his weapon to a 25 caliber handgun that he was shooting the family members in the head with. Then he came right back out, shot the youngest son. Oddly enough, he decided to switch his weapon again, grabbing a hammer and bludgeon the little girl Susan to death. Why he decided to go at her differently is such a big mystery and such a big question. I just couldn't get my mind around it. So whoever this was switched their weapon 3 different times and for some reason decided to go at the smallest, youngest girl with a hammer. After the killing was done, the killer decided to lock all of the doors, close all of the shades, and he even decided to cover up the bullet holes in the window with cardboard. When police arrived on the scene, they actually found Shirley's body hidden underneath the blanket near the front door. And her body was positioned to look like she had been sexually assaulted. Other reports and after autopsies were done, they found out that she actually had not been sexually assaulted. So police thought that this was like a way to divert the attention and make it seem like something happened that didn't. Now, Mr. Robeson's body was actually found in the hallway along with his daughter and his youngest son's body. They were like all piled in the hallway. So all of their bodies had been moved. And then lastly, the oldest sons, Richie and Gary, were both found in the back room where they had been to try to get that gun to defend themselves. So their bodies were found on the floor in the exact same place that they died. So it seemed that they had not been touched after being killed. Now, there were a few pieces of evidence that they found at the crime scene, which included the bloody hammer that was used to bludgeon little Susie for some reason, a bloody shoe print on the floor, as well as the casings from both of the guns used, the 22 caliber as well as the 25 caliber. These are the only pieces of evidence that were reported by police during this crime scene investigation. Even though they found the hammer, I guess a police officer had grabbed a handkerchief for some reason and like grabbed the hammer with it to take a picture of it and inadvertently wiped off any fingerprints that could have been there. So they couldn't pull anything off of it because somebody basically destroyed the evidence. After police did their investigation at the crime scene, the police basically came up with the theory that this didn't seem like it was just a random person off the street and a random killing. This seemed really personal because of the way that the different family members were killed. So they assumed that it had to have been somebody that knew the family, but also not just that, knew where the family's cottage was, because like I've said before, this cottage wasn't like in plain view on a regular street in a neighborhood. This was like, you know, basically in the middle of nowhere in a very secluded part of, you know, this entire community, surrounded by a lot of lush greenery, and you would have to specifically know where to go to find the Robeson cabin. So those are the details of the crime scene and the murder itself and what was found in the cottage, including the bodies, their location, the gunshots from the back window inward. They speculated that the Robesons were killed on the night of June 25th, 1968, just one day after Mr. Robeson had gone to Mr. Bliss's house to offer his condolences. The very next night is when police believe that the Robeson family was killed. So their bodies, you guys, had been sitting there for almost a month in the summer heat. So needless to say, their bodies were in really bad condition. They had decomposed terribly. So as you can imagine, the autopsies were a little bit difficult because the decomposition process was so advanced already because of how much time had passed. But also police officers felt a lot of pressure because by the time they got there, I mean, almost a month had passed. So trying to find the murderer and trying to put pieces together this late in the game was going to prove to be very difficult. The Robeson family was a really well-known and well-liked family by everybody in the community, both there near the cottage as well as in their hometown. They were upstanding citizens, they participated in the community, and Mr. Robeson was just known as an all-around good guy. So they were having problems trying to figure out who could possibly want to hurt the Robeson family. Because of the severity of the murders, it seemed very personal. Police decided to start investigating people that knew the Robesons personally, see if any of them had a motive to kill all of the Robesons. Their first person of interest was Mr. Robeson's right-hand man, Mr. Joseph Solero. Remember, I mentioned him in the beginning. He was the person information that Mr. Robeson left in charge of his magazine company anytime that he was gone, which was a lot. That means that Mr. Solero knew everything, all the ins and outs of the company, accounting, everything. So police started with him. So they start investigating Mr. Solero, who very quickly into the investigation, police officers found some really weird things about him and what he was involved in regards to the company, and started piecing together a motive. It didn't really take a whole lot of digging, but the police ended up finding out that Mr. Solero had been embezzling money from the magazine company. It had been discovered that Richard or his firm had been swindling and overcharging one of their top clients by the name of Delta Faucet by like thousands and thousands of dollars for advertising space within their magazine. It really wasn't clear whether Mr. Robeson was actually aware of all of these things. Going back to Mr. Joseph Solero and why he started becoming a prime suspect. So during police investigation, police actually found out that Mr. Solero had at one point or another owned both types of guns that were used during the murder of the Robisons. So when police officers asked him about these guns and their whereabouts, Mr. Solero conveniently said that neither of those guns were in his possession. One of them he actually said that he had given to Mr. Robeson, and the other he said that he gave to a brother. Now, they were able to confirm that Mr. Robeson had indeed taken over the first gun, but when they tried to find the location of the second gun that had been given to his brother, they could never locate that gun at all. Police had no evidence of him having those guns in his possession anytime recently, so they couldn't pull any fingerprints, and they couldn't say for sure whether or not Mr. Solero could have had anything to do with these murders. They asked Mr. Solero to take not one, not two, but 3 lie detector tests, also known as polygraph tests. So he takes them, and the first 2, you guys, he fails. And the third one comes back as inconclusive, which in my mind is failing too. There are multiple different reasons, but basically polygraph tests aren't 100% accurate. So because of that, polygraph tests and the results are not admissible in court. So even though he failed the first 2 and the third one was inconclusive, I mean, that wasn't like hardcore evidence for the police. So as if this whole thing with Mr. Solero wasn't strange enough, you guys remember how I told you at the crime scene there was a bloody shoe print? Turns out, surprise, surprise, Mr. Solero actually owned the exact pair of shoes with prints that matched the ones at the crime scene, but his were completely brand spanking new, like had never even been worn. You could tell by the soles of the shoes. They had never been worn outside. They had never seen the light of day. Now, the weird thing about this is people who knew Mr. Solero knew that he actually had a habit of owning 2 of everything. So he would own 2 of the same pants, 2 of the same shirts, 2 of the same shoes. But weirdly enough, he owned 2 of the same everything except for those pairs of shoes. He only owned 1 pair of shoes. So police actually speculated that he could have owned a second identical pair of shoes and he could have just thrown them away. But again, there's no evidence of this. The only shoes that they have literally never been worn, and like everything else is speculation. So Mr. Solero got out of that one too. This case is so exhausting. I feel like they got him, but then not really, you know, like the evidence isn't really truly there, but it like totally makes sense. So moving on, police officers decide to go ahead and investigate further and start interviewing more people within the magazine publication firm. So like other employees, right? And weirdly enough, Mr. Robeson had his personal assistant and they interviewed her. She actually confirmed that on the morning of June 25th, 1968, early that morning, Mr. Robeson had been calling into the office and his calls were in regards to missing funds and accounting. She said that he seemed extremely upset and that he kept asking to speak to Mr. Joseph Solero over and over and over, and that she had to tell him, Mr. Solero's not in the office. Shortly after she answered the phone call for Mr. Robeson, Mr. Solero took off from the office. And so she had to tell Mr. Robeson he's not here. And Mr. Robeson was pretty pissed, and that he was telling her, as soon as he gets back into the office, you have him call me immediately. Like, nothing is making sense. And it just seemed really sketch. Mr. Solero just dipped and he took off. Nobody knew where he went. So police officers went to the next best person to figure out where did he go, why did he leave, and what his whereabouts were, basically his alibi for the day of the murders. So they decided to go to Mr. Solero's wife and get a statement from her about whether or not she knew about her husband's whereabouts on the day of June 25th, 1968. She confirmed that he had left the office at like 10:30 in the morning that morning. She was honest and told police that she had absolutely no idea where her husband went that entire day. She didn't even try to come up with an alibi for her husband. And she even said, in our 20-something years of being married, he never disappeared on me like that. I always knew where he was. He would always call me and let me know and update me on his whereabouts. But on that specific day, he didn't. All I can tell you is that he didn't get home until 11 p.m. that night. Now we have a statement from Mr. Solero's wife saying that he was gone all day. After he left the office at 10:30 in the morning, which is around the time that Mr. Robeson had been calling in regards to missing funds within his business, that he just took off. His whereabouts were unknown, and he did not return home until 11 p.m. at night. I'm sure you guys were like me and like, yes, like that is more than enough evidence to tell me that like he went missing. Like, where else could he have gone but to go to the cottage and murder all of them and then not be home until really late at night? According to statements from nearby neighbors of the Robeson cottage, they heard gunshots at around 9 p.m. on the night of June 25th. People were known to like recreationally hunt, in this area. So hearing gunshots was not abnormal. But there were neighbors that said that they heard these gunshots around 9 p.m. The problem with that is the drive between Mr. Robeson's office and Mr. Robeson's vacation cottage was 6 hours. It would have literally been impossible from the time neighbors heard gunshots at 9 p.m. for Mr. Solero to commit this murder. 9 p.m. gunshots were heard, and then for him to be home 2 hours later at 11 p.m. because it was a 6-hour drive. So that's where police officers were like, things don't match up. Some people speculate that maybe a hitman was hired. Although that could be a possibility, police officers just felt like with such a short amount of time that it's a possibility, but it's really unlikely. Honestly, that's what made investigators kind of doubt whether or not Mr. Solero was actually involved in the murders of the Robeson family, because of the distance between the office and the cottage and the fact that gunshots were heard at 9 p.m. and that doesn't match up with the timeline for Mr. Solero to make it back home by 11 p.m. the way his wife had said. Although there was a lot of circumstantial evidence and this kind of makes sense for Mr. Solero, there was no hardcore evidence including DNA, fingerprints, possession of the murder weapons. There was none of that. So the investigation into these murders stayed open for about 2 years, right? Then on January 14th, 1970, a prosecuting attorney by the name of Donald Noggle decided that there were a lot of weird circumstances, but there was no hardcore evidence to bring an actual case against Mr. Solero due to lack of evidence. Nobody was brought to justice and the case was closed. Fast forward 3 years to March 8th of 1973. A newly elected chief prosecutor in Oakland County, he reopened the prosecution believing that this took place in his jurisdiction. Well, you guys, shortly thereafter, the minute this news hit that the case was going to be reopened for prosecution, Mr. Joseph Solero III ended up taking his own life in his office at the magazine company. Before he decided to take his life, he ended up leaving a note for police that read the following, and I quote, "I am a liar, a cheat, a phony, but I am not a killer. I am scared and sick. I did not kill the Robesons." He accompanied that letter with lists of companies and people that he had swindled and stolen from over the years. And then he also left a note for his mother specifically and tacked it outside of his office asking her not to enter the room. In the event that she came looking for him, don't go in there, because he didn't want her to see what he had done to himself. He then went and sat at his desk and took his own life with a .22 caliber handgun, of all things, the same type of gun that was used in the murder of the Robisons. Just when we feel like we're gonna get justice for the Robisons, Mr. Solero took his own life. So now there's nobody to prosecute and there's no justice being served. I know that this seems like straight shot, like how could anybody believe that it was anybody else but Solero? And like this should have been an open and shut case, like for sure. I do want to talk about one last thing that was a little sketch about what they found in the home of the Robisons. Now, during the initial investigation, shortly after discovering the Robisons' bodies, police officers investigated all types of different people and places, and one of those places, of course, included the Robisons' family home. So they go there, they start searching the home to see if they could find, you know, maybe a motive or maybe some clues as to who could have done this and why. They find this note, okay? So I'm going to be reading it directly from my phone that I took notes with. This superior table: Mr. Thomas, Mr. Richard, Mr. Joseph, Mr. Peters, Mr. Martin, and Mr. Robert. Along with these names came a note. The above shows the chain of power as decided by Mr. Robert, chairman director of the superior table, the governed power of this worldwide organization, which is sole set on complete peace and unity among all countries of the earth. Each of the above mentioned directors will receive a complete organizational breakdown from our computer headquarters. If you have any questions, please refer them through proper channels. So investigators took this note and started asking really close family and friends of Mr. Robeson, asking if they knew any information about this group, the superior table, and, you know, who they were and what this group was. And, you know, it's a worldwide organization, and literally nobody in Mr. Robeson's life even knew what this list was about, who the people were on it. Like, they had never even heard of it. Like, Mr. Robeson had never spoken about this. It kind of seems like, you know, something like the Illuminati, like a very, you know, underground secret club thing that Mr. Robeson was a part of and had notes about in his home. Some people speculate that maybe he was a part of a secret organization and maybe that's what got him killed, because nobody in his personal life knew about the superior table, and there was absolutely no other evidence. There was no other information on these people, where these notes came from. And these were people that were heavily involved with the Robesons, either family or close friends, and none of them knew anything about this. So that was really, really sketchy. The last kind of suspect that police threw out there as a possibility, but I mean, you guys let me know if you think it's a possibility. There was a serial killer by the name of the Michigan murderer. His name was John Norman Collins. He went on a killing spree between the years of 1967 and 1969. It was in the window of time that the Robesons were murdered. As most serial killers, usually they have patterns and like ways of killing and victims, you know, that they usually go after. And the Michigan murderer, Mr. Joseph Norman Collins, his usual victims were women, number one, and they were between the ages of 13 and 21. And also his method of killing usually included stabbing or strangulation. So his method and his victims didn't really match up to the Robeson family, but the only reason why investigators kind of threw his name out there was because he was an active serial killer during the window of time that the Robeson murders took place. Also because this serial killer just so happened to go to college with the oldest son, Richie, or Richard Jr. The police were kind of like, you know, like he could have, like, you know, he did know the son of Mr. Robeson, and maybe, you know, he knew where they vacationed. Maybe he was the one who killed the Robesons. Other than that, there was no evidence to show that the Michigan murder was even involved in the Robesons killing. He did end up getting captured and, you know, put in prison, and he never talked about the Robesons and killing them. He was believed to have killed up to 7 young girls, and he never mentioned, you know, the murders of the Robeson family. Let's go back to Mr. Solero, because there are just some things that I want to, like, you know, get your feedback on when it comes to him. So I know that there was a lot of evidence against him seemingly, but it wasn't like hardcore evidence. It was like, oh, he had these guns that were, you know, just like the ones used in the murders, but he didn't have them in his possession. There was no proof that he had them during the time of the murders. And, you know, there was no actual evidence, you know, or location of murder weapon, right? He did have a pair of shoes that matched identically to the bloody footprint that was found at the crime scene, but his shoes were absolutely brand spanking new. So there was no way that those shoes were used during the time of the murder. He failed 3 polygraph tests, well, 2 technically, and then the 3rd one came out as inconclusive. Last but not least, he did choose to take his own life shortly after finding out that another chief prosecutor had been elected in Oakland County and had reopened the prosecution against Mr. Solero. Do I feel 100% sure that Mr. Solero did it? Not 100%, and here's why. Because I find it really weird. You know how, like, he took his own life, yes, but he also took the time before taking his own life to write this letter, and he really seemed adamant about the fact that he was not a part of these murders and that he was scared. Like, he owned the fact that he was a phony and that he was a thief, and like that he had swindled all of this money from all of these companies. He even went as far as to list all of the companies that he had been involved in swindling. Then he made it a point to say that he had not been involved in the Robeson murders. And I just feel like when somebody decides to take their own life and they take the time to, like, write a letter, and it's like their last words, and it's basically what they want everyone to know after their death, I just don't know why. Like, if that was the time for him to come clean about being a thief and being a liar and being a phony, like, obviously he's already not leaving behind the best of legacies for himself. You know what I'm saying? So what would stop him from absolutely clearing his conscience and being like, I did, like, I was the one who killed the Robisons? I just don't understand. Like, if he really had something to do with it and he had the opportunity to come clean about the murders and he came clean about everything else before taking his own life, why would he not take that opportunity to finally come clean about murdering a whole family that everyone presumed that he did? Now, does that tell me that he was, like, absolutely innocent? No. Like, he could have just been like, you know what? I'm going to my grave with this. Like, I don't want anybody to know that I was the murderer of the Robeson family. Like, I just don't want anybody to know. Like, everybody can know that I'm a phony and I'm a cheat and I'm a liar, but I don't want people to know that I'm a murderer. It is a little sketch that he decided in that moment to take his own life. So let me know your thoughts, because I was kind of racking my brain, like, you know, if you had the opportunity to really, really clear your name and really, like, clear your conscience before making that decision, would you? Lastly, what I wanted to note that I found a little bit odd was at the crime scene when investigators went in there, you know, to look at the bodies. Remember how they found Mrs. Robeson, Shirley? She was found by the front door with a blanket over her. I feel like the killer took extra time with her, like not only trying to position her and make it seem like she had been sexually assaulted even though she hadn't, but also like trying to cover her. He really took the time to pay attention to her and move her body, and like it just seemed very specific with Shirley. Like, the 2 oldest boys, their bodies were completely left alone, and Mr. Robeson and his youngest son and his daughter, they were all piled just whatever in the hallway. Like, there was no care given to them. But Mrs. Robeson, her body was the only one that he like took the time out to position and to cover with a blanket and all of that. Like, doesn't that seem a little personal to you? Like, what if this was like one of Shirley's lovers? Like, what if she had been having an affair and this person got mad and decided to take her and her whole family out? Like, I just feel like it's really weird I mean, it could have just been as simple as they were just trying to throw the police off, but I just feel like it's really weird that this killer took some extra time on just her. Again, you know, we need to consider the location of this cottage. Investigators did know for a fact that Mr. Solero had been to the family cottage before. So he did have direct knowledge of where that cottage was, how to get there. You know, that doesn't look very good for Mr. Solero either. I don't know about you guys, but I'm a visual person. To like be able to get the whole story, I'm a visual learner. I did create this timeline that I want you guys to look at, okay? So that you guys can have a better idea of the sequence of events and when they happen. To recap, on June 24th, 1968, Mr. Robeson was last seen alive. He visited Chauncey Bliss to pay his respects for the recent passing of his son, left $20 for flowers, and also took the time to let him know that he would be leaving with his family to go to Kentucky to possibly purchase land. June 25th, 1968 is the suspected time of murder. Mr. Robison's secretary confirmed his calls to the office early that morning in regards to missing funds. He asked to speak with Mr. Scolaro, who was not available at that time. July 22nd, 1968. Chauncey Bliss, who was the caretaker and builder of the cottage, investigated the foul smell that was reported to him by the neighbors coming from the Robison's cabin that could be detected from over half a mile away. And this is when he stumbled upon the crime scene and found the Robisons dead in their cottage. The investigation remained open until January 14th of 1970. At that time, the current prosecuting attorney, Donald C. Noggle, decided there was not sufficient evidence for criminal action against Joseph Scolaro. March 8th, 1973, Joseph Scolaro commits suicide in his office using a .25 caliber pistol, very similar to the one used in the Robeson family murder. That's how the timeline is looking from beginning to end. So seeing all of that, I would like to ask you guys for your feedback. Do you feel like you're 100% sure it was Mr. Scolaro? Have you taken into consideration the secret organization or the serial killer? Let me know your thoughts down below. If you guys enjoyed this video and enjoy Pretty Faces Cold Cases here on my channel, please don't forget to give me a huge thumbs up to let me know. If you're not subscribed to my channel and would like to see more videos like this, story times and Ask Nikki's, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you are notified each time I upload a new video. Now, if you guys haven't had your fill of true crime, don't forget to head over to Sundance Now and check out their streaming services. You can stream for as low as $6.99 a month or $4.99 a month with an annual subscription, but they are offering my subscribers an exclusive offer of a 7-day free trial just to check it out. And if you like it, they will only charge you $1 for 3 weeks. You'll get a total of 4 weeks of streaming for $3, okay? So make sure you guys head to my description box down below for more information to get your free 7-day trial on Sundance Now to watch all of the thrillers and all of the true crime documentaries. Like I said, I'm currently in the middle of Killing for Love, which Amanda Knox has been talking about, and it is like a nail biter, you guys. I hope you guys check it out and enjoy it. Let me know your thoughts down below about this case. Thank you guys so much for coming back here and enjoying Pretty Faces Cold Cases with me this week. I love you guys so much, and I will see you guys very soon in my next video. Peace out.